Hey everybody, welcome to Today's Students, Tomorrow's Talent. Our show today is wide-ranging, talking about a variety of topics on the minds of people in the field of learning after high school. We have lined up a conversation that is well overdue. Just having returned from sabbatical, and joining me in the studio today is Jamie Marasotis, President and CEO of Lumina Foundation. Jamie, welcome to the show finally.
Thanks so much, Dakota. Thrilled to be here. Thrilled to be back, really.
I'm sure. I mean, I know you how long have you been back from sabbatical?
Almost a month. So still, it's a little bit like when you're in the bar and they turn the lights on at the end of the night. I'm still adjusting. I'm still going through some adjustment, but things are going very, very well.
Well, that's great. And for those who haven't been following your travels with great deal of interest, where did you go?
Spent almost 6 months in London. I decided that after 28 years of being CEO of 3 different organizations, it's time to take a little step back and do some reflection, mostly for personal reasons, to take a little time with my family. And the board of directors of Lumina Foundation was very, very positive. They actually encouraged me to do this. And also to give us some chance at the foundation for me to step away from the work to think about our long-term future. The change that's happening at a societal level is really accelerating. And I wanted to sort of step away from the day-to-day in order to think about some of those things, including working on a new book.
Yeah, well, I know we'll get into a lot of that. And I think it's unique, too. You brought the whole family to London with you. Is that right?
Yes. My wife, Colleen, and our 16-year-old Benjamin and our 11-year-old Elizabeth. The kids both went to an international school in London. We also were able to get them both playing for English football clubs, which was very exciting. So they got tremendous soccer experience. And Colleen and I spent a lot of time really, really getting to know the city of London in ways that I honestly haven't had the time to do. Even my 2 decades in Washington, D.C., I didn't learn as much about Washington probably as I should have. I was really able to do that in London, and that was a very, very positive outcome. Again, I think for me personally, but also I think for Lumina Foundation as we think about how our work impacts communities.
Yeah, and Elizabeth won an award. Did I hear that right?
Elizabeth won an award. She was the top scholar in the 5th grade at her school, which is I'm not quite sure how you do that after just one semester, but that went really well. And Ben played for a club that actually has a real men's team, and he actually was able to play with the men's team on a few occasions, and so that was sort of interesting to play with real players. And as a 16-year-old, I think it was an extraordinary experience for him.
Yeah, are they bringing that back here now? I mean, I know you were just at NGA, and I think it was someone from Minnesota, a governor from Minnesota, was asking whether they're going to have a pro soccer team soon, and I know you encouraged them to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. The governor of Montana, Steve Bullock, was talking about how recruiting an MLS team is an important part of what you need to do now as in a state or in big cities. And yeah, we found that, look, London has 15 professional football clubs. So it is deeply embedded in the culture, and sort of bringing some of that back and helping our kids do a better job of reintegrating with their football experience, I think is really neat thing, a wonderful outcome from the time away.
So, you mentioned just a moment ago that you really had some time to learn London in a way that even when you had lived out in D.C., you didn't really feel like you got to know D.C. that way. And that sounds like it's a really ripe way to take advantage of the time of a sabbatical. And I think when a lot of people think of sabbaticals, they think of academia. And I'm wondering, is a sabbatical something that is common in philanthropic practice, and do you see other foundations doing it?
There are foundations that do sabbaticals. They tend to be shorter than the 5+ months that I took, but there are foundations that do it. It's fairly unusual for CEOs to take sabbaticals. I think that's an unusual innovation that we piloted at Lumina Foundation. I'm a big fan. I always have been a big fan. I've just never taken advantage of one. I do think it's important for people to step back from their work and think more about the long-term future, particularly if you've been someplace for a while. I had already passed my 10-year anniversary at Lumina when we decided that it was time for the sabbatical. And I think that from a philanthropic perspective, our job is to take risk in order to achieve outcomes that maybe society can't achieve on its own, whether it's through public policy, through private sector innovation, what have you. Philanthropic organizations have certain capacities that others don't. But you really can't take that risk if you've got your head down and you're constantly thinking about the day-to-day and what you're trying to accomplish in your current work and your current plan. So I think it's a good thing for philanthropic organizations in general. I certainly think it will be a good thing for Lumina Foundation long term.
So how did you structure some of your time while you're abroad to make sure that you were getting that kind of perspective that you were looking for?
Well, part of it, as I said, was taking time literally every day to experience London. We did guided tours by a tremendous guide of neighborhoods, of museums, of other places. We also set aside time every day, Colleen and I, to work. I worked a little bit on the book every day, or tried to work every day. It wasn't every day. And Colleen is very civically engaged here in Indianapolis. She's currently the board chair at the Orchard School, so she was connected to her work that way. So we were able to structure our time that way. But it's the unstructured nature of the initiative, I think, of the effort that I think is really important. And then the integration into life in London. We were temporary Londoners, but we weren't there on vacation for 6 months. We were trying to live our daily lives. Our kids were in school. They were playing soccer. We were cooking. We were, doing all the things that you do in normal life. And that part was also a part of the rhythm and the part of taking a step back and reflecting. You just don't normally have time to do that in the kinds of jobs that we do in these very outcomes-oriented philanthropic organizations like Lumina.
And so, as you were kind of embedding yourself in what would be the every day of being a Londoner, I guess I'm curious about, were there some things that popped out of you about the way that, either folks in London or England or even more broadly in Europe are thinking about issues, or the way their daily lives are manifesting in ways that kind of, struck you in a way as you're going through your reflective kind of process here?
Well, every American knows that Brexit is sort of the cloud hanging over England and the UK more broadly. And that's true. There was a lot of discussion about Brexit. But Londoners have been through a lot over history, right? From bombings in World War II to the tremendous social change that they've seen in recent decades. They've been through a lot. And so Londoners are very practical. And one of the things that we experienced is Londoners just sort of getting on with their lives and dealing with technological change, managing all of the things that come from how do I work differently because of the changing nature of work. London has also gone through a dramatic demographic change in a fairly short period of time. So London went from more than 80% white Englanders, in other words, people who are native to England in the 1990s, to less than 60% today. And actually a majority of Londoners are not from England anymore because there's been such an influx of immigrants to the city. So it is very much a dynamic, vibrant place. David Brooks, who's a very proud New Yorker, has talked about the fact that London may be the most dynamic city in the world right now. And I think I understand his perspective because, in fact, London felt very active and dynamic, even with that overhang, that cloud of Brexit and the fear about what might happen post-Brexit among a lot of the Londoners. So the demographic differences, the fact that it is so culturally diverse that we were able to see and experience that in food, in culture, in language, in lots of ways, I think was important to see. I'm a native of the East Coast. I grew up not too far from New York City. I experienced some of that in New York, but I experienced it in very different ways in London and in a very sort of contemporary sense. 1 out of 4 Londoners is Muslim. And so, that was a sort of different experience for me as someone who's grown up in the U.S. and particularly right now living here in Indianapolis. We just don't have that kind of exposure. It's a very, very positive thing, I think, in terms of your outlook, your perspective on what the world is really like.
Mm. And so as you're kind of, thinking about how some of the lessons that London could maybe teach us, especially maybe American cities or America at large, I'm already hearing from you a little bit of an emphasis on some of the pragmatic nature of this, and I'm wondering, we've talked about how they might the conversation about race and culture in London and England more broadly is slightly different is different dramatically, I guess maybe, than how it is here in the United States. And is there any particular lessons learned or things that we should be modeling after the ways that they're having those conversations or that pragmatic approach?
I'd say 2 things. One is that, we've seen in the U.S., and they've certainly seen in the U.K., the sort of challenge that the conversation about immigration is bringing to both countries. The U.S. is a nation of immigrants. It's been part of the strength and the great opportunity, I think, that defines us as Americans. England has also been a very welcoming country, but immigration has become a very big issue and has challenged both countries, I think, in a lot of extraordinary ways. What we saw in London was this incredibly welcoming welcoming culture, I think, that I think was indicative of how to sort of turn a challenge into an opportunity. The mayor of London is very much focused on this idea that London is open to all. And we saw that in terms of, from mundane things like public signage to very much this sort of attitude, this day-to-day view that we are stronger because we are different. And those differences are something that we should embrace, not try to avoid. And so I think that's a really important lesson as we think about the changing nature of work, as we think about how learning is going to impact work. How do we think about who the people are that are actually working, the people who are going to need to learn, and understanding that different cultures, different languages, different perspectives are an important part of both the learning and the working cultures. That's something that I really took away from London that I think will be important to our work at Lumina going forward.
I've heard you talk a lot about lately about the kind of new model, the need for more innovation, the new model between education and work, or learning and work. And then historically, you've talked about how we've kind of followed this sequential chronological path. First you learn, then you go to work, and how that's not really in the current context today. And I was hoping you can kind of expand a little bit on that thought of what you're seeing around the new context of learning and work.
I think it's hard for us to get out of the model that we've been in literally for more than a century in the post-industrial era, which is this idea that, you learn for a certain period of life, and then you apply that learning in the context of your work. And what we've seen now for a couple of decades is this blending of learning and working that we know the educators have been talking about this concept of lifelong learning, which, by the way, to consumers sounds like a sentence. It does not sound like an opportunity.
Yeah, right.
It sounds like something you never have to, that never ends. And so I think the language really does matter here. That my view of this is that there's a ratcheting process of learning and working. And as the ratcheting increases, you get rewards on both sides, both the learning side and the working side. And we have to think about the integration of learning and work over the course of someone's working adult lifetime as something that would be important for us to plan for, not to treat as an exception, but actually plan the systems around that. That has very powerful implications for an organization like Lumina Foundation, which has been, and likely will continue to be, focused on this notion of post-high school learning, powering economies, and strengthening democratic systems. It seems to me that if we think about the integration of learning and work, we've got to think about how you actually make that happen. How do you bring learning to the workplace? How do you bring work to the learning process so that people are understanding the practical nature of work as they're doing learning? And I don't think that we've been as systematic as we should be. We've mostly focused that on adult populations, but less so on the entire sort of trajectory of learning. And I think that will be very important. At the same time, and this is part of the theme of my new book, I think we have to be thinking about this in the context of human work. In other words, the work that only humans can do in this age of smart machines. In my view, we don't do enough to think about what are the tasks that are going to be associated with work going forward, and what are those tasks that we as humans are uniquely qualified to do. We have compassion, we have caring, we have an ability to actually be more complex conceptual thinkers than machines can be, and at least for the foreseeable future, that's likely to endure. So how do we prepare people for the escalating, changing nature of work while we increasingly focus on preparing people for human work? And I think that's part of what we need to be thinking about from a learning perspective from organizations like Lumina Foundation, but more broadly as a society, we need to be thinking about all people as learner workers, and helping them get better prepared for that learning and working future will be a very important part of our success as a society.
as you're talking, I'm reminded of this conversation. I know you've probably had many of these, and we all do, where I hear you talking a lot about the need for skills and the need for, for us to really look at the model of education that we've been currently operating under, that has been created over, many, many years. And a lot of times people who work in liberal arts fields and others get really nervous about the skills-based conversation, about this like vocational tracking, workforce aligned only. At the same time, I hear you saying that by focusing on the human elements of work, we are talking about some of the skill sets that oftentimes, liberal arts and others, but espouse, talking about critical thinking, compassion, empathy, all of those, more cognitive elements. How do you wrestle with this idea, this shift towards a more skills-based kind of education system that is going to meet the needs of today and tomorrow's workforce, given where we currently are in the education climate, with this kind of wrestling between skills versus, this kind of natural pushback that we have towards skills-based education?
And one of the things, Dakota, that I pointed out in my 2016 book, America Needs Talent, is that talent is really this amalgam of things, right? It's education honed through things like experience that can then be applied to work and life. In other words, talent is some combination of cognitive and non-cognitive things. Now, on the cognitive side, it's very important to think about knowledge, skills, and abilities. All of those things really, really need to come together. So what we need to be doing is making sure that people do have practical skills. That's absolutely true, right? So it's the specific things that you can apply in your current work that's really important. At the same time, you got to continue to develop both your non-cognitive side, if that makes sense, but also develop the more generalizable things, the critical thinking, the problem solving, your ability to communicate. All of those things need to be developed as well. And I think historically we've thought of talent as some sort of innate ability. The reality is that talent is a combination of those cognitive and non-cognitive things. So you've got to actually plan for and prepare people for work by thinking about how you better prepare both their skill sets and their knowledge and abilities. So that means that we've got to give people broad tools, those generalizable tools, while also continuing to hone their specific skills that they can apply in the current work context. That's why this notion of learning and working together is so important, is that it's not a one-stop shopping experience, right? You can't get some skills and then go out and apply the skills. Most employers, by the way, say they value the generalizable things more than the specific skills, although you need the specific skills to be successful in most jobs. So making sure that we continue to build both of those, the specific technical skills and the generalizable knowledge and abilities, I think it's really, really important to have a plan for how you actually do so.
Well, I really appreciate that, especially, I have a background as being a musician, and the same applies for, I imagine soccer players. And I remember when I auditioned, you don't know this, but when I auditioned to get into college, my professor looked at me and said that was the worst audition I've ever heard in my entire life. It just so happened it was a low enrollment year, so that's how I got into college. I just got lucky. But when people would say, "Oh, you're really talented," I would say that I am actually not. I'm horribly untalented. It's just a combination of skills and experiences, and combined with the work that have been ratcheting up together that have made me to be able to perform where I am. I'm sure I am not a soccer player at all. I'm sure Benjamin can run circles around me without a doubt. But I think the same can be said there. And it's always struck me as interesting how we apply talent in the kind of that context, but don't allow talent to the same definition to carry over in other areas.
I tell people all the time, my dad played guitar and mandolin for 85 of his 93 years on Earth, and my dad never learned how to read music. He certainly had some innate ability, an ear, people used to call it, for music, but he worked very hard at developing and honing the craft. He practiced it, and he repracticed it, and he learned new things. And so music is actually a good analogy for the sort of broader experience. There are certain things that people are better at or worse at, depending on their innate abilities, but it's being able to hone and develop the things that you maybe do have some natural ability with that's important. And sometimes you don't know what those things are unless you try a lot of different things. That's what the learning process is really all about. It's about that discovery, that exploration. And that's why, to go back to a prior question you asked me, that's why things like the liberal arts, I think, are going to continue to be important. However we define the liberal arts, I think the important question will be that you've got to provide broad capacity for people to learn because the future is uncertain. And with that uncertain future, we've actually got to help better prepare people for the different iterations, the different possibilities that life will bring them, whether it is on the job, in their families, or as participants in their communities.
So, building on that, we're clearly talking about where you're going to be learning and developing and practicing these variety of skills in multiple places, which reminds me that we need to make sure that all learning is actually counting, that is being recognized, and that irrespective of where a learner, acquires a new skill set, that it can be kind of recognized and continue to be built upon, again, with the ratcheting theme that you're talking about. Have you seen good examples or been able to reflect on some places that might serve as models for us, or, what are some of the major challenges as we work towards a system where all learning might count?
I think learning from the experiences of others is very important. So I'm always a believer that the best way to develop a better model than the one that exists is to learn from as broad a context as possible. In the case of Lumina Foundation, I think we'll probably need to do more learning from the international context. So we've seen people in the education space sort of obsessed with the Finland model or the Singapore model as examples of things that we can learn from. And I think that's right. But we shouldn't be applying Singapore or Finland or any other model to our unique context in the U.S. I do feel like we should be spending more time better understanding the context of countries where work and learning is much more integrated. So the German model, for example, the Swiss model, are both good examples. I saw some of this when I worked in Southern Africa, in South Africa in particular, in terms of these sort of apprentice-type models. So I think it will be important to learn from those kinds of experiences. At the same time, I think learning outside of the context of either the education or the workspace will be very important. I think there's lots of interesting things going on in other spheres that we need to be paying more attention to. This is part of my new challenge to myself, I think, hopefully a new opportunity to Lumina Foundation, is that I need to be spending more time being the what's next person for Lumina Foundation, thinking more about what's coming down the pike that is not just about changes in learning strategies or theory or changes in how people are thinking about the future of work, like all the conferences that we've all been to. It's thinking about these broader contexts of technology, of climate change, of, even I think things that might be well outside of our experience set, like what's happening in the field of health, that might impact sooner than we think what will happen in the context of our work at Lumina Foundation as this entity trying to see itself as a catalyst, a leadership organization for systemic change in the post-high school learning level. So, I look at our efforts at Lumina Foundation as leadership-oriented, as systemic change-driven. In order to really do that, you've got to, as I did on my sabbatical, pick your head up and look at the rest of the world and better understand what's going on out there. So learning from those kind of experiences, I think, is going to be critical to our success at Lumina Foundation going forward.
It's interesting to hear you say that, we really need to be looking at other fields of interest or other fields here in the United States, how we're approaching climate change or healthcare. Is there, something in particular that's been nagging at your mind as a why haven't we noticed this before, or an industry that you're particularly interested in keeping an eye on?
Well, I do focus on climate change for a specific reason, which is that our awareness of climate change, I think, was altered pretty dramatically in a fairly short period of time at a societal level. Now, there's a backlash against that, and I understand that's sort of a political issue. I understand that. But as a matter of fact, climate change is something that we probably should have understood sooner and taken action on very quickly after that. And there is some analogy there to our space of learning and working, that we can sort of see the changes coming, and yet we haven't moved fast enough on the systemic changes, right? So the demographic changes that we're experiencing, this has been the train coming down the track now for decades. Have we been preparing ourselves for the large-scale demographic changes and different learning styles and different cultural backgrounds and different linguistic opportunities? Have we really prepared ourselves for that? Climate change may give us some answers to that because of the way in which that conversation appeared to accelerate, where we saw companies embracing green not just as a socially responsible thing to do, but as a winning strategy for them from a sort of bottom line perspective. We've seen how climate change is actually changing the nature of conversations about broader things like food insecurity and water and other things. And so I think there are implications for our work in a sphere like climate change that are actually relevant. Will those things impact our efforts at Lumina in terms of Goal 2025? Maybe, but it clearly will be impacting our work as a foundation that's planning to be around for a good long time and wants to continue to be system change oriented, catalytic in its efforts as an organization that has this extraordinary gift. We have a large base of assets and a highly talented team of people that are actually all rowing in the same direction, trying to achieve large-scale change.
Well, that's fascinating to think about the connection between those two things, and certainly I hear you that there will be some hopefully some lessons that we can be learning and extracting from how we have all been responding to climate change, and then of course I'm already curious about why haven't we responded to the demographic changing nature that we've known has been coming, and yet we haven't made those same pivots in the way that we've seen so much traction with some of the climate change items that you just listed out.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, Lumina's proud of its equity imperative, and that equity imperative is the socially correct, socially just thing to do. But it's also very practical. The issue of the equity imperative is about our collective well-being as a society. And I think it's taken us too long to understand that from an education and work perspective. We need to learn some lessons from other spheres so that now that we're sort of getting better at things like the equity imperative, we can learn about some of the things that have impacted other fields like climate change and how that's going to maybe accelerate the changes that we're going to need to implement in the worlds of learning and work.
So, of course, the conversation about working at a systems level and emergent themes, I'm, of course, reminded what's out in the national media right now about the field of learning after high school. And of course, it's easy to jump to the presidential race that's going on. And, sometimes I think about the system change that we're talking about here and its absence in some of the public dialogue, particularly as it relates to the current race that's going on. And I'm, from your perspective, are we talking about the right things at this juncture, given that context, knowing that is a really, whether we like it or not, there are really it's a great hook to get out really key issues that are of importance to America. And so are we talking about the right issues, or should we be shifting the conversation?
I do think the conversation needs to shift. I think a lot of the conversation that we've had right now about new financing mechanisms, for example, whether it's free college or ISAs, those are good conversations to have. But at the end of the day, they're really sort of treatments. They are, in effect, trying to apply a treatment to a problem without really getting at the root cause of the problem. And the root cause on the financing side is that the price of delivery of learning is just too high to support the rising demand for talent that we have as a society. So at a public policy level, what we've got to be thinking about is how do you better deliver literally more learning to more people, right? So more learning, high quality learning to more people, but find ways to do so at a radically reduced cost. We live in a world of finite resources. We have to accept that. We certainly see that that's what's happening in both states and at the federal level. And so understanding how we can actually address that, I think, will be really important. And so, I think that these are positive conversations that are coming up in the context of presidential campaigns, gubernatorial races, et cetera, but I don't think they are dealing with the root causes. And the root causes are that at a fundamental level, our educational system was designed for a different time in society. There's no reason to sort of do post-mortem diagnostics when the challenges ahead of us are so important and so imminent in terms of our work. We know that this model is not serving enough people and is not serving enough of them well. And I think from a public policy perspective, we should be thinking about public policy solutions, whether it's in delivery systems, financing models, quality assurance, whatever the issue may be. How are we going to serve more people better, and how are we going to do so literally at a cost that makes it possible to increase the talent level that society needs? That to me is what we must focus on in the presidential campaigns and in the public policy conversations going forward.
So it sounds like the kind of innovation that we need in order for us to be successful and prosperous as a nation needs to happen pretty fast and at a pretty wide scale.
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think there is an urgency, and this may be the other sort of learning from my experience of being on the sabbatical, is that when you pick your head up, you see how much has changed and how fast things are moving. And understanding that, in fact, the imperative for talent is growing in society, and better preparing people for that human work is growing in urgency. And so seeing this as something that requires our focused attention as a society, seeing how Lumina Foundation as one organization that's trying to catalyze system change, how we can actually participate in that and use our leverage to the greatest extent possible, that's really important to me. But I do think that urgency is upon us. And Goal 2025, when we came up with it in 2008, was an effort to apply a sort of urgency to what we saw as a challenge in 2008, right? Which was that our international competitors were doing better than we were, and we saw the data even back in 2008 about the changing nature of work and how there weren't enough people with credentials to meet the demands of the labor force. Well, now a decade later, we see that with greater focus, with even more clarity, and now that urgency has increased. But going forward, the question is going to be, how do we change the system given that urgency? And I think that systemic change is going to require private sector innovation, it's going to require government policy, and it's going to require something that you've been really a sort of national leader on for us at Lumina Foundation, which is how communities can actually participate in and drive some of that change. You need the top-down pressure, and you need the bottom-up pressure in order to create the change, the squeeze in the middle that's necessary. And from my vantage point, we should be continuing to focus on both opportunities, both sides of that equation.
Well, Jamie, I'm really glad that you're back and setting a really important vision for us and for the nation, and of course, continuing to set a very high bar for us all to reach. So thank you for joining us today, and welcome back. And we're excited to loop back around with you. I know that the book, and you're still working on all of that. So, when we get ready to talk about that, we'll have you back on the show.
I'd be delighted. It's great to be back, Dakota, and I've never been more proud of Lumina Foundation than I was in the 6 months that I was gone, watching all that you and your colleagues accomplished and everything that was being done in my absence made me very proud to call me the CEO.
Well, on behalf of all of us, thank you. And excited for the future.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. My thanks to Jamie Marasotis for joining me today, and thank you all for listening in. If you have a comment or idea for a future show, reach us at luminafoundation.org or reach me on Twitter at Dakota Pilecki. See you next time.